Alright, now that you have written a rough draft, it's time to go back and add quotations. Now understand that quotes are not necessary. You can turn in this entire essay without a single quote and I will not be upset with you. Quotations are used when the author has said something that you just do not know how to rephrase, or they just said it so well that you need to use it because you just think it really makes the point, or you need something to prove that what you're talking about isn't total bullshit, that you really do know what you're talking about, and this quote proves it. Often we use quotes to present statistics or facts along those lines. Now, when you're putting other writers' work into your writing, a quotation must be 100% exactly the same as the original. You cannot correct spelling, you do not correct bad grammar, you do not change anything in it. There is a slight exception to this rule which we will talk about later, but you're not so much changing as you're editing, and I'll explain the difference on that later. So you do not change any of the wording in the original quote, and you must put it in quotation marks. Paraphrasing, I strongly urge you to avoid paraphrasing. First of all, when teachers talk about paraphrasing, they're actually using the phrase wrong. Paraphrasing is when you take a famous phrase, something that people are all familiar with, and you alter it slightly to make a new point. For example, a man named Will Rogers once said, "I never met a man I didn't like." Okay? So, for a joke, Sesame Street has Cookie Monster say, "I never met a cookie I didn't like." They're making a joke. Everybody's familiar with that phrase. Well, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people are familiar with that phrase, so they get to laugh at what Cookie Monster said. Often, politicians will use paraphrasing this way. You shouldn't be doing this. It's a very complicated thing, and it's hard to do it properly, and you're more likely going to mislead your reader. Stay away from paraphrasing. Now, when your teachers talk about paraphrasing, they're just saying, take the original statement as you found in your article and just reword it. That's still plagiarism. Don't do it. It's very, very difficult to accurately reword something that somebody else wrote in a way that does not duplicate what they originally said. If you like it that much, quote it. Otherwise, like I told you in the previous slideshow, put all your research aside and write your first draft off the top of your head, because you want to avoid that plagiarism. And that's what the next one is, summarizing. That's where you're just taking everything that you read and you're rewriting it in a shorter format. Yes, all the articles you read before, you had a 20-page article, a 10-page article. You had a book that was over 100 pages. I don't want to read all that. You're taking the points from those different articles, those different sources, and you're telling me the pieces that I need to know. So you are summarizing. So think about it that way. You've done a lot of reading, you've got a lot of information in your head, you're summarizing those main ideas to make a point. Now, why do we do this? They serve many purposes. You want to use them to make a claim that supports what you're saying. They add credibility to what you're saying. So it's not just you saying it, look, this expert said it. Refer to work that leads up to the work that you're now doing. Okay, so you're working on something that's really more for researchers in the field. They're saying that, okay, I'm trying to develop this new idea, and look, all these people before me have said this. Doesn't this kind of suggest that we should be going this way? You want to give some examples so that, you're saying, okay, I've pointed out this major point about my subject. Now, here's what some other people have said about this thing. You may want to point out something that someone said that you strongly agree with, or something you strongly disagree with, and that's actually going to be your next essay. Again, you might want to say something that the author has said in just such a way that's so perfect, it's going to make such a difference in your essay. It's going to bring out the idea just so perfectly. And sometimes, again, you want to distance yourself. So it's not just me saying this. Look, somebody important has said it. Okay? Beware of what you find on the internet. As Abraham Lincoln said, if it's on the internet, then it must be true. The difficulty with quotations taken from the internet is that it is very difficult to know if they are authentic, according to Abraham Lincoln in 1985. I actually found this on the internet. Yeah, right. So be careful. There's a lot of fake information out there. A lot of fake news. There are several ways to put quotations into your text. Often, short quotations work best. You really don't want to spend a lot of time on longer quotes. Why? Because a long quote really looks like you're just trying to pad your essay, that you don't know what you're talking about, and you're just slapping a lot of information in there to meet the page criteria. I'm going to call you out. If I see a lot of long quotes, if I see way too many quotes, I'm going to tell you to take them out. I'm going to look and say, this is a good quote, keep this, get rid of this one. So be careful. Short quotes are best. And remember, you don't have to have any quotes. You're only looking for things that are really backing up the points you're making. Also remember that when you use quotations, you must use quotation marks, and you must have an opening pair and a closing pair. Can't tell you how many times I have seen an opening pair of quotation marks and there's no closing pair. I have no idea where the quote ends. It's going on for 3 paragraphs. Where does this quote end? Oh, look, a new quote. Damn, it had to have ended somewhere back there. Quotations must be presented accurately and verbatim. They must be word for word the same as the original. If there's a spelling or grammar in the error, do not correct it. You're going to capitalize the first letter of a direct quote when the quoted material is a complete sentence. Okay, so if it can stand alone, capitalize that first letter. Mr. Johnson, who was working in his field that morning, said, "The alien spaceship appeared right before my own 2 eyes." Notice the capitalized T, because that sentence can stand alone. Do not use a capital letter when the quoted material is a fragment or only a piece of the original material's complete sentence. So if it can't stand alone, we don't capitalize it. Although Mr. Johnson has seen odd happenings on the farm, he stated that the spaceship certainly takes the cake when it comes to unexplainable activity. If you're going to interrupt your quote in mid-sentence, do not capitalize the second part of the quotation. And we do this sometimes because of variety. If you're constantly saying, Mr. Johnson said, and then Mr. Johnson said, and Mr. Johnson said, and then you're just giving, that's boring. So first of all, you want to find synonyms for said, and you don't always have to start the sentence that way. You can start the sentence with Mr. Johnson said, or you can interrupt it part way with Mr. Johnson said, or you can put it at the end of the quote, said Mr. Johnson. Okay? For example here, "I didn't see an actual alien being," Mr. Johnson said, "but I sure wish I had." In all the examples above, note how the period or comma punctuation always comes before the final quotation mark. This is a huge mistake that people make all the time. Punctuation is inside the quotes, not outside. It is important that in MLA format, APA format, all of these say to do it this way. So until somebody comes out and says there's been a rule change, you keep the punctuation inside the quotation mark. Quotations are most effective if you use them sparingly and keep them short, like I've said before. Too many quotations in a research paper will get you accused of not producing original thought or material. So in other words, it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. You're just trying to bluff your way through the essay by plopping a bunch of quotes in. Also, it gets boring reading a whole bunch of quotes. And I don't think you really understand what you're talking about. And it just might as well be called plagiarism, because what you're doing is what we call the article report. It's not a research paper anymore. This is just, here, paragraph 1 says, in this essay, I saw this, quote, 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 quote. Now, in my next paragraph, this article said, quote. Then you might as well just say, here, read the following articles. I'm not learning anything about what you understand. I want to hear your words. I want to see what you learned. Every quotation must be introduced in your text with a phrase that refers to the source, using a comma to separate the phrase from the quote. Okay, now when I say this, I don't want you saying, in the article titled blah 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 by author so and such and such and such, but you just don't plop a quote in. You can say, Tom Smith, an expert in outer space research, or NASA researcher Tom Smith said. Somehow or another, you want me to understand why you're leading into this quote, or you can just introduce it by letting it flow from your previous thoughts. So as you can see, there are still people who believe in UFOs, as seen in this statement by Mr. Johnson, a farmer in Nebraska. Okay. Things like that allow me to understand where this quote's coming from. Just plopping quotes in requires the reader to do way too much thinking to try to figure out what this means. Give me some help. So like in this example, Mr. Johnson, a farmer in Nebraska, stated, everybody knows that little men from outer space abduct our cows on a regular basis. Now, remember I said before that you must duplicate the quote exactly as written? Well, there are two exceptions to that rule. Sometimes you need to add a word for clarity. That the original quote is a really good quote, but taken out of context, taken away from the original paragraph, you lose something that makes it clear. So you have to add a word or two. So in this original quote, Mr. Johnson said, as they don't have any on their planet, any what? What don't they have on their planet? So we're going to add a word to make sure that you can understand the quote. As they don't have any cows on their planet, Mr. Johnson explained, they need to take ours for milk and cheese and butter. Now, this is kind of a silly example, but you might be using a quote about, say, NASA trying to go to Mars. And they're just talking about the sand there is rich in iron. And so, well, where's there? Mars. Or you might need to explain something. Are we talking about a moon of Mars? Or what are we talking about specifically? Where is that sand? Okay, so you may need to add a statement to explain, clarify. Now, the other exception to the absolutely 100% the same rule is that sometimes you have to omit things. Sometimes you have a quote that's really long and you really only need two parts of it, and you can take out a chunk in the middle. Or you could take off the ending of the quote. You know, we haven't gotten to the end punctuation mark, but we don't need to go that far. Like a lot of people will quote Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. Well, that's only the first part of that sentence. So you should have 3 dots at the end of it to let me know that there was more to that sentence. This is called an ellipsis. 3 spaced dots, 3 periods in a row. This indicates that you've edited something out of the original quote. So there's more here, but it doesn't apply to what you're trying to say. You just want to use the first part of it. So rambling on, Mr. Johnson explained that we need everybody to arm themselves with guns, pitchforks, knives, and he goes on and on and on, listing all these weapons you could use. We don't really need to hear all of them. Spoons, sticks, and rocks to patrol our fields at night to protect our cattle. So I left just enough of them in that you get the idea. We don't have to run on for 4 lines with all the examples he gave. If you are citing a quotation that contains another quotation, place double quotation marks around the entire quote, and then the interior quote has single quotation marks. Mr. Johnson finished his speech by quoting President Roosevelt, remember, friends, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Block quotes. I have yet to find a good example for this, so I'm sorry this slide is so plain. Block quotes are when you have a huge chunk of information that you really have to include. This often applies to when you're doing statistics, or you have to provide a very clear-cut definition and it's pretty long, but you need all of it. In a block quote, you're going to indent the entire quote. You're going to separate it like it's its own little paragraph, and you're going to indent it on both sides so that it's not reaching the full margins on either side. And you'll single space it. I strongly encourage you to avoid block quotes, because again, most people use block quotes because they're just trying to pad the essay. But if you really feel that you need it, you need to use a long quote. You don't stick it in your regular paragraph. You separate it and identify it this way. Okay? So those are the rules for quotations. So now you can go back to your rough draft and start adding quotes as you feel are necessary. Our next subject is going to be about how to cite, how to identify your sources of information. See you then.